Greetings. I'm Pastor Diana Thompson. I'm the called pastor at the Canton City Lutheran Parish in Canton, Ohio, and the administrative pastor at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio. Thank you for joining me. We are in episode 37 in our study of the Acts of the Apostles, or otherwise known as the Book of Acts. It is actually our second to the last episode. So if you have jumped on here and found us randomly, thank you. I encourage you to watch this episode and then go back to the beginning, or you can pause here and start from the beginning, but it has been a joy to journey with you through this amazing book. Again, this is the second to the last episode, and I am thankful for everyone who has joined me throughout this study, and I hope that you have found this to be a gift for you as it's been a gift for me. I encourage you to have a couple tools with you to help you in this process. First is a Bible. It can be whatever translation you have available. It can be printed or digital, whatever you have access to. And then I encourage you to have paper and then a pen or pencil to write down your thoughts, ideas, questions, inspirations, doodles, drawings, musical inspiration, whatever comes out of this time together and helps you to process this information and wisdom that the Bible gives us. So again, those are the tools that I encourage you to have. You're welcome to write questions and comments on the YouTube channel in the comment section, or if you'd prefer a more private conversation, feel free to reach out to me on my social media or email, which you'll see at the end of the video. So in today's episode, we are in chapter 27 of the book of Acts. We are going to be discussing 3 stories. They are all part of Paul's journey towards Rome. First, he set sail in verses 1 through 12, and then a storm at sea, which is verses 13 through 38, and then finally the shipwreck, which is verses 29 through 44. So as I've mentioned throughout this series, the writer of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles is the same author, and there are 6 themes that this author weaves in and out of all of the stories that are happening. And not every story touches on every theme, but they do run throughout both the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. First is God's redemptive purposes. Second is salvation for all alike. Third is the blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth. Fourth is table fellowship. Fifth is the role of a disciple. And sixth is the importance of an accurate witness. So some general notes. Remember, Paul has finished his conversation with Festus and Agrippa in Caesarea. Agrippa is the king in charge of the Jerusalem area, and Festus is the Roman governor of the area. And they have both interviewed Paul, had conversations with him, have found no reason for him to be kept in prison. But Paul did appeal to a hearing with the emperor. And as a Roman citizen, that was his right. And he is now being transferred to Rome, not necessarily as a prisoner, but as someone who has now requested an audience with the emperor's court. So Paul is on his way. But what we find is that Agrippa, at the close of our previous study, said this man could have been set free had he not appealed to the emperor. So Agrippa and Festus found no cause for Paul to be arrested. They would have released him, but because of this request, Rome is now required, or the government is now required to send him to Rome for the hearing that he has requested. Now remember, Paul was promised that he would be able to preach and share the word in Rome. And so Festus and Agrippa continue to be agents of God, even though they are not believers. So I think this is really important to remember, that the work of God will often have agents who are not believers that make sure that God's mission happens. And so this is what is happening now. They could have said, he is set free, there is no cause. They could have said, you don't need to go. But they said, he's done what has been asked, and by law we are required to send him, so we will do this thing and send Paul on his way. So now we find ourselves in the first stage of Paul's voyage to Rome. So this chapter is just the first stage. Obviously, as I mentioned, it ends in a shipwreck. So clearly there's more travel that happens afterwards. And it starts out actually relatively slowly. And no puns intended, is the calm before the storm. We as the readers are introduced to Paul's traveling companions in verse 1, and a traveling itinerary, which I will put up a map to show that, in verses 2 through 8. And then we see a whole bunch of delays and difficulties that ultimately start pushing this trip into dangerous travel time. So it makes it very interesting, because Paul has been promised that no one would die on this trip, that no one would be killed. And so these delays actually feel counterintuitive to God's promise to protect Paul and those who are traveling with Paul. And obviously some of those are not traveling of their own accord. They're actually prisoners being transported to Rome. Paul is traveling under guard, not as a prisoner, but as someone who is due the right of a hearing in Rome. But there are some that are actually prisoners being transferred to Rome. So let us read verses 1 through 12 as Paul begins his voyage to Rome. Chapter 27, verses 1 through 12. When it was decided that we were to set sail for Italy, they transferred Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustinian cohort named Julius. Embarking on a ship of Adamantium that was about to set sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly, allowing him to go to his friends to be cared for. Putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. After we had sailed across the sea that is off Caesarea and Pamphylia, we came to Myra and Lycia. The centurion found an Alexandrian ship bound for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Snindrus, as the wind was against us. We sailed under the lee of Crete off Salamone. Sailing past it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lasea. Because much time had been lost and sailing was now dangerous, because even the fast had already gone by, Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I can see that the voyage will be with danger and much heavy loss, not only of the cargo and of the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. Since the harbor was not suitable for spending the winter, the majority was in favor of putting to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they would reach Phoenix, where they would spend the winter. It was a harbor of Crete facing the southwest and northwest. So as you notice, the narrator returns to first-person storytelling, which we last saw in chapter 16, verse 10. And this storytelling is told in the first person, which was actually very typical of ancient fiction. And this story of the travel by sea follows kind of a parallel model of some other ancient Greek novels. So the narrator places himself in the story to serve as a witness to Paul's heroic actions throughout this story. Now, Paul, in the midst of all of this, is often compared to Jonas, who was a prophet that was put at the mercy of the sea. And Jonah. And Jonah, the prophet Jonah, if you remember this story, was a resistant prophet. He did not want to go to Nineveh to do what God had asked him. So he had gotten on a boat and was caught in a tempestuous storm. And we're going to see this happening with Paul later. And here's the difference. This is where the compare and contrast goes on. Jonah was trying to travel away from God's will. Paul is traveling according to God's will. But even in the midst of the tempest, Paul continues to serve as an anchor of calm in the midst of the chaos. Paul clearly is serving as an agent of God and seeking God's purposes, where Jonah continually was trying to be disobedient to God's will. We also note that the writer of this passage clearly was an experienced traveler, just as Paul was, and understood and was good at describing the risks and the challenges of traveling, especially during this particular time of year. So this is important to realize, that kind of that accurate nature of Luke's writing is that he wanted to make sure we really understood where Paul was traveling and the difficulties and challenges of travel at that time. So Luke showed his knowledge of the Mediterranean Sea and what voyages on it would look like. And we might even ask the question, why so much detail? Why is this so interesting? But the details show us that there is this pattern, no matter what the pattern is, whether it was the weather, whether it is where the ships were able to take port, whatever, just reinforce that Paul's call to Rome was not going to be thwarted. There was nothing that was going to stop Paul's arrival. Now, we had some named people. There were other prisoners with Paul on this ship. And so, of course, we have the narrator, who doesn't name himself. We have Aristarchus, who is supposed to be accompanying Paul, though we don't know his reasons why. Of course, the other prisoners, and then the centurion named Julius, and then, of course, the other centurions under Julius's leadership. And then, of course, the sailors of the ship. So we have a large contingent of people traveling. And so the question people had is, well, why was Paul allowed to have people traveling with him? And the belief is that he would have been allowed traveling companions because he was a Roman citizen, or maybe even just because he had such notoriety in Palestine. But we really don't get a whole lot more information on the detail of who the military escort were, or then what the other prisoners were being charged with. So looking at verses 2 through 8, after hearing the passenger list, the ship is ready to set sail for Rome. And from the way this Luke writes this is clearly the first of two boats or ships that would be used. So first, they board what would be considered more of a ferry to the Asian port city, and then from there they would get another ship that would be more suited for the open seas of the Mediterranean to go from Asia to Rome. But again, as we mentioned, there will be a series of delays and difficulties, including the wind and unfavorable weather that would make this whole trip a challenge. There's repeated references to severe headwinds and the difficulty in sailing. And as Luke mentions, there are a number of days at sea and still a long distance from Rome. So looking at verses 9 through 10, Paul is warning that this trip is hazardous. Remember, they had already landed in fair havens. There was well understood that they were now moving into the winter, where travel would become more and more hazardous. And Paul advises them that if they do this, they will be undertaking a very dangerous trip. Now remember that this is not a prophecy in the sense of, if we do this, this will absolutely be the outcome. Instead, it is a reminder that he is a seasoned traveler, that he understands that they are now at greater risk. So the fast is the Day of Atonement, Rosh Hashanah. So usually that's observed in late September, October of the Roman calendar. So again, we are moving into the winter months. The weather is getting more tricky. It is more hazardous to travel by sea. And one of the things to be aware of is the Mediterranean shipping lanes going to Rome closed in the wintertime. So this is not, they're really pushing the boundary of safety by pushing onto Rome and not finding a place to winter over. So Paul's warning only comes true in part, as we'll see later, and that there will be losses that happen, and it will be a dangerous journey, but ultimately no one will die. So Paul is saying we are putting ourselves at risk. Instead of waiting, we're pushing forward. So the ship's captain, the majority of people, and of course the centurion leader say, no, we're going to push on. So Paul's suggestion and guidance was disregarded. So the fact that Paul could even say this to the centurion Julius actually says that he must have been held in some positive regard, because Julius is the one who's in charge of the voyage, not Paul. And if Julius didn't have some respect for Paul, he wouldn't have listened or heeded any of the prisoner's advice, regardless of how good it sounded. So Julius makes his decision that it is time to push on to Rome and goes for that. But the other understanding, and that we see here, is that Fair Havens was not a suitable place to spend the winter. So it probably was that hope that they would make it to this location called Phoenix, where they could then rest and spend the winter before they continued their journey to Rome. But again, Paul said, this isn't a good idea. We should just winter here. Thank goodness Paul was being protected by God, because clearly there was a disregard for what Paul had to say. So the next section is the storm at sea. This is verses 13 through 38. So let's read those verses. So remember, they are heading towards Crete. When a moderate south wind began to blow, they thought they could achieve their purpose. So they weighed anchor and began to sail past Crete, close to the shore. But soon a violent wind, called the northeaster, can tell I'm from the United States, we have nor'easters, right? Rushed down from Crete. Since the ship was caught and could not be turned head on into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven. By running under the lee of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After hoisting it up, they took measures to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run into Cyrist, they lowered the sea anchor, and so were driven. We were being pounded by the storm so violently that on the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. And on the third day, with their own hands, they threw the ship's tackle overboard. When neither sun nor star appeared for many days, and no small tempest raged, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Since they'd been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete, and thereby avoid this damage and loss. I urge you now to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship. For last night there stood by me an angel of the God to whom I belong and of whom I worship. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor. And indeed, God has granted safety to all who are sailing with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that will be exactly as I have been told. But we will have to run aground on some island. When the 14th night had come and we were drifting across the Sea of Adria, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took soundings and found 20 fathoms. A little further on they took soundings again and found 15 fathoms. Fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. But when the sailors tried to escape from the ship and had lowered the boat into the sea, on the pretense of putting out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and soldiers, "Unless these men stay on the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the boat and set it adrift. Just before daybreak, Paul urged all of them to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been suspended, and remained without food, having eaten nothing. Therefore I encourage you to take some food, for it will help you survive, for none of you will lose a hair from your heads." After he had said this, he took bread and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then all of them were encouraged and took food for themselves. There were about 276 persons in the ship. After they had satisfied their hunger, they lightened the ship by throwing the wheat into the sea. So it was a long storytelling about a storm and an experience at sea, 14 days, and that seems extremely excessive, but as we'd said, this was the traveling seasons where one were at risk. So this second stage of Paul's voyage was the arrival of the northeaster, which seized the ship and drove it out of the traditional travel lanes along the coast and into the larger sections of the Mediterranean Sea. Having been set adrift and unable to put up the sails, the ship was kind of pushed around wherever the wind took it. It said the ship would be pounded to destruction in chapter 27, verses 16 through 20. But just at the verge of their physical and emotional exhaustion, Paul delivers a prophetic word from God, whom he says, "I belong and whom I worship." And he assures them all of God's favor and their safety as they are part of Paul's personal destiny. So this is just this strange arc of reality. Paul had told them before they set out on this journey that it was a bad idea, but ultimately comes around to say God will protect the people. He does say the ship will be destroyed, but God will protect the people. So let's look at verses 13 through 15. So it's quite clear that Luke has knowledge of the southern coastline of Crete, and recognizing the perils of traveling from Fair Havens to Phoenix for the winter. You'll see a map right up here that shows kind of those islands. Remember that they had left Fair Havens and they were sailing past Crete close to the shore. And it says they ran under the small island of Clauda. But that is when they were scarcely able to control their ship. So this is when those winds really came in. And then there was fear of running into the island of Cyprus. And this is when they lowered their sails and they dropped anchor, trying to maintain some control, even though obviously you don't have much control when you don't have your sails up. But this is a major storm that has come upon them. So as we on the east coast of the United States know, a nor'easter is a heck of a storm. It usually comes from the north and it blows across, for us, the Atlantic Ocean. It can bring with excessive wind, excessive precipitation, whether snow or rain, depending on the other temperatures. But here again, this same storm creates havoc for these sailors on the southern coast of Asia and into the Greek islands. So there's only so much that can happen when the ship isn't in the natural protection of the islands. So the leeward side would be the side where the wind there's less wind. And when you get out of those places, that's when you have to be in control of your ship and not being pushed further out to sea. So this narrator uses seafaring jargon to really help create the scene that we're noticing, and the fact that sailing on the Mediterranean Sea was a high-risk endeavor. And it's not uncommon to have other stories about people traveling on the sea in ancient times. It happens not only, obviously, in some of Luke's stories, but also in other ancient stories, where people would then throw over the cargo. They would throw over animals. They would do whatever they could to help make the boat ride a little higher in the water. They would do anything they could to help protect the ship so that they could safely get ashore. And then, of course, it's this overwhelming forces of nature that overcome the skill and experience of the sailors. These would not be sailors that are new. There was always experienced sailors. If there's any new sailors on a ship, they are not the ones making all of the big decisions. So the fact that traveling was dangerous. Traveling by road was dangerous. Traveling by water was dangerous. So in verses 16 through 20, we see the emergency protocols being followed by the sailors as would have been in any situation. So they were able to drift behind the wind wedge that was caused by the small island Caudia, which is now Gaudes. And that gave them a brief moment to prepare for the fact that they were heading into this wind. So they attached a lifeboat to the hull, and when they to help make the ship more secure, they actually wrapped heavy ropes around the ship to help support the wooden structure of the ship. So they basically bound the ship so that the ship would hold its integrity. And then the lowering of an anchor produces additional drag, which would allow the ship to stay clear of the sandbars around the islands. So the sandbars of Syrtis and the Gulf of Sidra, where it would potentially break the boat apart. So they were doing everything they could in the midst of this violent storm. So it took them 2 days to do all this safeguarding. And then on the third day, even after all of that, they had to take more extreme measures to save their lives. So they threw over the cargo, and then as the last resort, they threw over the ship's tackle. And the ship's tackle is all of the extra gear that would be needed in the boat. Extra sails, ropes, anything that could be jettisoned and gotten rid of were gotten rid of. So this is that sense of like we're at the end. We're getting close to just being in the worst of dire straits. And this is when we get to verses 21 through 26. But yet, even as it all seems to be lost, Paul once again speaks. And he reminds them that they were given notice that this would be a dangerous journey. But then he turns into encouragement. And he reminds them that even though they had made a poor decision to take on this journey at this time, that they would not be harmed, that they would survive, and they are to be courageous because they are participants in Paul's mission. That the angel that came to Paul had promised that no one would perish. And though it might seem strange why anyone who wasn't Jewish or Christian or a follower of Paul would even be interested in listening to what he says, it's not uncommon in any of the pagan communities it was common in all of the pagan communities to be aware that there were divine messengers that would share messages with human beings. So it wasn't beyond the possibility that he was getting a message from an agent of God, even if they didn't believe in his God. So as Paul is talking about the safety and protection, not only to himself and his personal travel companions, but also then to this pagan crew and then the military personnel and the other participants, he says that Paul, worship the God who created the sea and the dry land. He is saying that the God who created all of this is promising us protection. But then again, as we look at Jonah versus Paul, Paul continues to be faithful to what God has called him to do and to honors the message that is given to him from the angel, where Jonah, after receiving an angelic visitation and is told to share the promise of God's salvation, chooses to be disobedient. So Paul assures the people of their deliverance from death, even though the cargo has already been lost and the ship will be grounded. Paul is trusting in God. So this is the third time in the book of Acts that Paul is told, in different words, but again the same promise, that Rome is the city of his destination. So Paul, you must stand before the emperor, in verse 24 is repeated in various words in chapter 19, verse 21, and chapter 23, verse 11. So God's future plan for a Roman mission are disclosed to Paul during a time of personal suffering and have become the practical effect of bringing him comfort. And Paul then uses that comfort to take to his companions, that they too will be rescued. And that is because they are associated with him, and that God will save him and all who are present with him. So I think that's just really important to remember and to hold up. Now, as they were nearing the 14th day and they were drifting, in verses 27, we start to see that the sailors were looking up, were realizing they're probably getting close to land, and they were taking soundings. And I don't know if you've heard that term before, but soundings are weighted ropes that are marked at different levels, and they take a sounding to see how deep the water is. So first it was at 20 fathoms and then at 15. So they realized they were getting closer to a shallow. And of course then the fear in verse 29 is that they would run into rocks or a sandbar or something else. And running aground in a boat is a guarantee that the boat will be broken apart. And so the sailors, and it says here in verse 30, as a pretext of putting out anchors from the bow. Remember, they had anchors at the stern, and that was to help keep the boat in the right direction so that it wasn't broadsided by waves. But they were claiming that they were going to put anchors on the front. But Paul understood that this was not what they were going to do. They were actually going to take the lifeboat and try to escape the boat so that they could get to land. And Paul knew what was happening, and he told Julius the centurion what was going on and said, we will die if they leave. We all have to stay together for God's promise to be fulfilled. And so the soldiers were ordered to cut the ropes to the lifeboat, and the lifeboat was set adrift. And so verse 33, just before daybreak, Paul urged all of the people to take food, again saying this is the 14th day. that we have been in suspense and remained without food, having eaten nothing. So they've been fasting, not because they want to, but you can't cook when it's unstable. It's not uncommon when ships were in those circumstances that no food was prepared. You couldn't light a cooking fire. So at this point then, Paul encourages them and invites them to take nourishment. And if you caught the influence of kind of the Last Supper Eucharistic idea where Paul took bread and blessed it in front of everyone, that is not it is not a mistake. It is not a Eucharist in the true sense, because Paul would not do that with pagans. The Eucharist is just a Christian meal, but he gives thanks and he offers prayers as a witness before the crowd. He doesn't pass the bread to them, but again, it's still that overtone is there, even though it's not a true Eucharistic meal. That's in verse 35 for those who wanted to look at that. And so, of course, after saying his prayers and eating his meal, the other people then took nourishment as well. And it's at this point we find out that this ship held 276 people. And once they'd eaten that meal, in the final act to save the ship, they threw the last of the food off the ship. So they are now without any food at all. So in verses 39 through 44, we have the shipwreck itself. In the morning, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned to run the ship ashore if they could. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea. At the same time, they loosened the ropes that tied the steering oars, then hoisted the foresail to the wind. They made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the ship aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the forces of the wave. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none might swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land, and the rest to follow, some on planks and others on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. So we see that this promise that all will be protected comes to fruition. But did you notice in that meal, they all satisfied their hunger, and in that moment, they are now seeing an opportunity for salvation, right? They were seeing their opportunity to be saved. They found land, and there actually was a beach, a bay with a beach on it. So the sailors we're going to aim for that. That's what we're looking for. And though they did their very best, they did come across a reef, which actually is a place that's called a place of two seas. So it was probably more of a sandbar than a reef as we think of coral reef. But needless to say, where these two seas come together, you have waves coming from both sides. So they're probably coming around the bay, and this is a place where those waves hit together. The sand builds up, and the ship is struck on it. So the waves are battering this ship apart. And of course, because the lifeboat had already been cut loose, because the sailors were trying to escape and abandon the ship, they now had to reach land without the benefit of a lifeboat. But even in the midst of all of this, the military men wanted to make sure that they were not going to be in trouble, and they were going to kill all the prisoners, because it was better for a prisoner to die than for a prisoner to escape, because then those people that were transporting them, those military men who were transporting them, would be held liable for their escape. So their goal was to kill the prisoners, but Julius wanted to protect Paul, prevents that plan from occurring. And the fact is there really wasn't a whole lot of place. They were on an island, so there really wasn't any place for these people to escape to, but that really wasn't the point of why Julius, he was doing it to protect Paul. And so we have this this order for those who could swim to shore, those who couldn't to find something to float on to get themselves to shore. And ultimately we hear the fulfillment of the promise that was given to Paul, that no one would die, that they would be safe even though the ship would be lost. So Paul's prophecy and of protection by God came to fulfillment. So this is where we are going to conclude this episode. As I mentioned, next episode will be our final episode, will be in episode 38, and we will be in chapter 28 of the book of Acts. But before we talk about our next episode, let's look at the themes and how those themes might be played out in our stories today. So one, God's redemptive purposes. God promised that Paul would be preaching in Rome, and God did everything God could to make sure that happened. And in that process of saving Paul from this shipwreck, God saved all the other people that were with Paul. So two, salvation for all alike. I think that indicates that God is a saving God. And so the second one, by saving all the people with Paul, reinforces the idea that God is seeking salvation for all people. Three, the blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth are not topics in this episode. Four, table fellowship. This is the first time we've seen table fellowship in a while. It's not true Christian table fellowship in the sense that all are gathering under a Christian sense of meal, but Paul actually basically becomes the host of the meal. He invites everyone to eat a meal together on this 14th day of this horrific journey. And so there's that table fellowship, that commonality of eating together. The fifth theme is the role of a disciple. And again, the role of a disciple for Paul was to be faithful regardless of the circumstances, and that Paul was. He was an agent of calm and contemplation in the midst of environmental chaos from the storm, but then also in those moments of chaos when the sailors tried to bail on the ship and leave other people behind. He was an agent of calm and steadiness in the midst of the chaos that was happening. And then six, the importance of an accurate witness. And again, this is how is Luke, the author of the book, faithful to the political, the geographical, the biographical settings of the time. And as we see on the maps, as Paul travels, that this person really has, if doesn't know firsthand, has done their homework in making sure that this journey makes sense, that this journey to Rome goes in a proper fashion and isn't jumping back and forth in strange directions, and talking very clearly and concisely about what it means to travel by sea in the northern Mediterranean. So again, next week is our final episode, episode 38. We are in chapter 28. So we find Paul on the island of Malta, and then ultimately Paul arrives in Rome, and while he's there, he has encounters with Jewish leaders, and he preaches in Rome. So that will be the conclusion of this study series in next week's episode. As always, thank you for joining me. If you have questions or reflections or comments, feel free to put those in the comment section on the YouTube channel. If you would prefer to reach out to me via email or my social media, those contacts will be up here shortly. Grace and peace to you, my dear Theophilus. God is with you.